December 17, 1944. The Ardennes forest, frozen, silent, and full of danger. A single fuel truck crawls down an icy road, its headlights cutting through the snow. Inside sits one tired American driver who doesn't know he's lost yet. But this wrong turn will become one of the most important mistakes in the whole war. His truck carries not just gasoline, but the power to stop Hitler's final attack. Before this night ends, one man's confusion will save hundreds of lives and change history. This is the untold story of how a lost driver's courage helped win the Battle of the Bulge. If you love forgotten war stories and real moments of courage, make sure to subscribe, like, and stay till the end. You won't believe what happened next. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were quiet, heavy with snow. The world believed the war in Europe was almost over. Hitler was losing ground on all sides. His armies were broken and tired, his cities in ruins, but deep inside his headquarters, in a place called the Wolf's Lair, he planned one last strike, a surprise attack, so bold it could change everything. He called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's goal was simple but desperate: divide the Allied armies, capture the Belgian port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate peace. He wanted to split the British and Americans apart, destroy their supply lines, and give Germany a final chance to recover. But to do this, he needed something more important than tanks or guns. He needed fuel. That is where the Ardennes came in. The thick forest in Belgium and Luxembourg seemed an unlikely place for a major battle. Its narrow roads, deep valleys, and heavy snow made it hard for tanks to move. But that was the point. The Allies believed it was too difficult for a large army to attack there, so they left it lightly defended. To Hitler, the Ardennes looked like a secret doorway. One last chance to surprise his enemies. He ordered 250,000 German soldiers, nearly 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 guns to gather silently behind the trees. Every truck, horse, and train was used to move fuel, ammunition, and men. They hid everything from Allied planes under camouflage nets and frozen branches. The attack was set for December 16, 1944. But there was a cruel paradox at the heart of the plan. The German army needed fuel to move, but it didn't have enough to even reach Antwerp. Their tanks would have to capture Allied fuel on the way. If they failed, the offensive would die on the road. One German officer wrote, "We had enough gas to get there, but not to get back." That single fact, gallons of gasoline, would decide the fate of Hitler's last gamble. When the attack began, it was sudden and violent. At 5:30 in the morning, German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front. Thousands of shells lit up the forest. American soldiers, many of them new recruits, were caught completely off guard. "We thought it was thunder," one private remembered. Then the trees started exploding. Columns of German tanks pushed forward, their engines growling through the snow. Villages like St. Frankfurt, Clairvaux, and Bastogne were swallowed in smoke. Within hours, the German advance pushed 50 miles into Allied territory, a bulge on the map that gave the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. At first, the Allies were confused. Communications were broken, the weather was terrible, and air support was impossible. Snow and fog grounded Allied planes. Generals had no clear picture of the attack. What they didn't know was that the German offensive, though terrifying, was already running out of gas. Behind every tank and every gun, armies need roads full of trucks. The US Army had learned this lesson early. Its strength was not only in firepower, but in supply. Every American soldier at the front had behind him hundreds of drivers, mechanics, and clerks making sure fuel, food, and ammunition never stopped moving. The Germans had no such system. By late 1944, their supply lines were a wreck. Allied bombers had destroyed oil fields, refineries, and transport lines. The Reich's once powerful industry could produce only 25% of the fuel it needed. In fact, by December 1944, the Germans were rationing every drop. One report from a panzer division said, "We have 20 tanks operational but fuel for only 10. And yet, Hitler insisted the attack continue. He told his generals to move fast, capture Allied supply dumps, and live off enemy fuel. It was a plan built on hope and desperation. Meanwhile, on the American side, the lifeline of the entire front ran on gasoline. Every Sherman tank, every jeep, every supply truck drank from a vast river of fuel shipped across the Atlantic and pumped through hoses and drums across Europe. By December, the U.S. Army was burning more than 800,000 gallons of fuel a day. One major wrote in his diary, "Without gasoline, we set just a bunch of sitting ducks with rifles." And somewhere inside that giant machine, among the drivers, loaders, and mechanics, was one man named Jack Miller. He wasn't a hero in the newspapers. He wasn't a general or a pilot. He was a truck driver, part of the Motor Transport Corps. His job was simple: keep moving, no matter what. He hauled fuel through France and Belgium, a rough, dangerous job. German planes sometimes strafed the roads. Ice turned trucks into skidding metal beasts. Drivers slept in their cabs, ate cold rations, and followed convoys through blacked-out nights. On December 17th, the second day of the Battle of the Bulge, Jack was ordered to deliver a full tanker of gasoline to a forward supply point. Snow was falling hard, and the roads were jammed with retreating units and scattered soldiers. The radios buzzed with confused orders. Somewhere in that chaos, a signpost had been knocked over. Jack Miller took the wrong road. He didn't know it yet, but that wrong turn would carry him toward the front lines, toward a group of American tanks that were out of fuel, stranded, and about to be overrun. His lost truck, filled with 2,400 gallons of high-octane fuel, would soon make the difference between retreat and resistance. As one officer later said, "Wars are won by men who deliver on time, even when they don't mean to." The Battle of the Bulge was not only a fight of bullets and courage, it was a fight of fuel and movement. Every gallon mattered. Every truck mattered. And sometimes history itself depended on a driver who got lost in the snow. But this was only the beginning. Long before a tank fired its first shell or a plane took off into the cold winter air, there was one thing every soldier depended on: fuel. Gasoline was the quiet heartbeat of the Allied army. Without it, the greatest military machine in history would simply stop moving. Every gun, every truck, every tank, every kitchen stove in the field needed fuel. Even the field hospitals ran on it to power lights and heaters. Soldiers used to joke, "We don't run on courage, we run on gas." It was a joke with truth behind it. By late 1944, the United States Army in Europe was burning almost 1 million gallons of fuel every single day. A single Sherman tank needed nearly 2 gallons of gasoline just to drive 1 mile. Each division on the move required over 60,000 gallons a day. It was a supply chain that stretched like a steel artery all the way from America's oil fields to the front lines in Belgium and France. Fuel came by ship across the Atlantic, then through ports like Cherbourg and Antwerp. From there it was pumped through pipelines or loaded into convoys of tank trucks. The men who drove these trucks were called Red Ball Express drivers, part of a giant transport network that had kept the Allies moving since D-Day. These drivers were mostly young, often African-American soldiers, many just out of high school. They worked day and night in all weather, under fire, to keep the front supplied. One of them remembered, "You didn't stop, not for sleep, not for food. If a truck broke down, another one pushed it. We were the bloodline." The Germans understood this too. They didn't just aim at tanks, they aimed at the fuel that fed them. During the Battle of the Bulge, they planned to capture Allied fuel dumps and use the gasoline to drive their own panzers deeper into Belgium. Their armored divisions started the offensive with barely enough fuel for 3 days of fighting. A German colonel later said, "Our tanks were lions without food." The plan depended on finding American gas. And at first, it almost worked. The sudden snowstorm grounded Allied planes and made it hard for supply trucks to move. Roads froze. Convoys slid into ditches. Some depots were abandoned in the rush. The U.S. First Army ordered fuel rations. Tanks were told to move only when absolutely necessary. The irony was cruel. The world's most powerful army was surrounded by mountains of ammunition and supplies, but in some places no one could get them to the front. Everything depended on the men of the Transport Corps, the truck drivers. That's where men like Jack Miller came in. He was one of thousands who sat behind the wheel of a big, heavy GMC truck, the kind they called deuce and a half. Each one carried fuel drums, ration boxes, or ammunition crates. The trucks formed endless lines along the icy roads of France and Belgium. Jack's truck was a 750-gallon tanker, loaded with high-octane gas meant for tanks and armored cars. The smell of it was sharp, oily, and dangerous. Every driver knew that a single spark could turn their truck into a fireball. You didn't smoke, you didn't even think about it, one veteran recalled. They drove without headlights, using only the dim glow of the truck ahead. Their eyes burned from exhaustion. Engines roared in the darkness, the sound echoing through the hills like waves of thunder. When the snow came, and it always did, it stuck to their gloves, froze on their eyebrows, and turned their breath into clouds. Jack had been on the road for nearly 10 hours when his radio crackled with new orders. A front-line division was running dangerously low on fuel. They needed every drop. He was to take a direct route north, fast. He didn't know the full situation. He didn't need to. Orders were orders. Behind those simple orders lay a vast and invisible machine, the Allied supply system. It was the true weapon that made victory possible. By December 1944, the Allies had built 11,000 miles of pipeline across Europe and operated over 50,000 transport trucks. Historians would later call it the logistical miracle, but for the men living it, it was a daily grind of danger and fatigue. One officer wrote in his diary, "The real heroes are the ones who get the gas through. A tank without gas is a coffin." At the same time, German fuel problems were becoming deadly. Their once mighty Luftwaffe could barely fly. By late 1944, many fighter pilots were training on wooden gliders because the Air Force couldn't spare fuel for real planes. The Army's panzer units were forced to abandon tanks simply because they ran dry. In one captured report, a German commander complained, "Our advance halted not by the enemy, but by our own empty tanks." This was the strange truth of modern war. Power no longer came only from bravery or bullets, it came from barrels, and that truth turned Jack Miller's small mission into something much larger than he could ever imagine. As the Battle of the Bulge grew fiercer, fuel became as valuable as life itself. Soldiers fought for villages not because of strategy, but because those villages had gas depots hidden in barns or churches. In some places, American troops destroyed their own supplies just to keep them from falling into German hands. Every drop counted. When Jack set out into the snowy darkness, he was part of a giant, invisible race. The race to keep the engines of freedom alive before the panzers could starve them to death. He couldn't have known that the map in his glove box was wrong, or that a broken signpost ahead would soon lead him off course. He couldn't have guessed that his mistake would decide the fate of a battle. In that winter of 1944, fuel was more than just gasoline. It was time, strength, and hope, the silent fire that kept an army alive. And for one lost driver in a snowstorm, it would soon become destiny. When people think about World War II, they often picture tanks, planes, and famous generals giving bold orders. But behind every tank that rolled forward and every plane that took off, there were men with wrenches, grease, and aching hands, the men of the Motor Transport Corps. They were the quiet muscle of the Allied army, the ones who kept everything moving. In the winter of 1944, this corps was made up of thousands of drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers. Many of them had never seen combat. They weren't trained to fight. They were trained to deliver, but their job was just as dangerous. When the roads were bombed or covered with snow, they still had to move. When the front lines shifted suddenly, they were often caught in between. An American officer once said, "If the trucks stop, the war stops." It was true. Each driver was responsible for a truck loaded with hundreds of gallons of gasoline, ammunition, or food. The trucks traveled in long convoys, sometimes 200 vehicles or more, crawling through muddy or icy roads. The sound of their engines could be heard for miles, a deep, steady growl that filled the night air. The men called their trucks jimmies or deuce and a halfs. They had thick tires, rough suspensions, and a cabin that rattled like a metal drum. The heaters rarely worked, and the wind cut through the gaps in the doors. Drivers wore gloves without fingertips, so they could still grip the steering wheel even when it was frozen stiff. In the Battle of the Bulge, the Motor Transport Corps faced their hardest test yet. The German surprise attack had thrown the front into chaos. Roads that were safe yesterday were full of enemy patrols today. Bridges were blown up, and fuel depots were either captured or burned, yet the supply lines had to keep running. Jack Miller was one of these men. He wasn't a soldier with medals or stories of glory. He was a driver, one of the thousands whose bravery had no headlines. Before the war, Jack had driven delivery trucks in Ohio. He was used to long hours and rough weather. The army needed men like him, steady, patient and unshakable behind the wheel. When the snow started falling in December 1944, Jack's unit was stationed in eastern Belgium. Their orders were simple but vital. Keep the frontline divisions supplied with gasoline. The roads twisted through forests, across frozen rivers, and past bombed-out villages. Signs were often missing or buried under snow. Sometimes they followed maps that didn't match reality. Roads were gone, bridges collapsed, entire towns erased. Still, the convoys rolled. Drivers used chains on their tires to keep traction. They followed the dim red glow of the truck in front of them. There were no headlights. Light could draw enemy planes. The nights were so dark that men said they could only tell where the road was by the feel of the tires under them. Driving was blind faith. One driver later said, "You couldn't see the road, you just trusted the rumble of the wheels and prayed the guy in front didn't stop." The trucks carried everything: rations, ammunition, spare parts, even medical supplies. But gasoline was the most dangerous cargo of all. One stray bullet or spark could turn the truck into a burning coffin. Drivers learned to stay calm when German aircraft flew overhead or when shells burst nearby. They didn't panic, they just kept moving. The Motor Transport Corps had another big problem: fatigue. Drivers were on the road for 18 hours a day, sometimes longer. They slept in their cabs, heads against the steering wheels, wrapped in blankets. They ate cold rations or coffee from metal cups, trying to stay awake. Some would talk or sing to themselves just to keep from falling asleep. Jack Miller had been on one of these long hauls before. He knew the rhythm of the road, the smell of gasoline, the vibration of the engine under his boots, the faint whistle of wind through a cracked window. It was a strange kind of peace, even in a war zone. The road became his world. But in December 1944, that world turned deadly. When the German army launched its surprise offensive, they targeted roads and intersections. They knew that if they could cut off the supply lines, the Americans would freeze and starve in the snow. German commandos dressed in stolen US uniforms even changed road signs to confuse convoys. That was the kind of danger Jack and his unit faced. A single wrong turn could send them into enemy hands. Yet the Motor Transport Corps kept going. They hauled over 400,000 gallons of fuel per day during the height of the Battle of the Bulge, a record under such brutal conditions. One field report described their courage. Trucks went through roads shelled by artillery, through forests full of snipers, but the drivers never stopped. If one truck went down, the next one pulled around it. It was not just bravery, it was discipline, duty, and pride. Many of the men believed their work mattered more than medals. One driver said simply, "I didn't carry a gun, but I carried the fuel for those who did. That was my fight." As the snow thickened and the roads froze, the convoys stretched farther apart. Jack's truck was loaded with high-octane gasoline. His route was supposed to take him to a refueling depot outside St. Vith, a small town now under threat from German tanks. But the situation was changing faster than any map could show. Somewhere along the road, a bridge had been blown. A detour was marked with a new sign, but the sign had been switched by German saboteurs. It pointed Jack in the wrong direction. In the days ahead, that small mistake would turn into something far greater. For now, though, Jack just kept driving. Snow fell in heavy sheets, the world around him white and silent, except for the hum of his engine. He was tired, cold, and unaware that history had just placed him on the wrong road, the road that would make all the difference. The Motor Transport Corps never asked for fame. They asked for working engines, full tanks, and clear directions. But in war, even the smallest error could rewrite destiny. And for one tired truck driver in a white forest, destiny was only a few miles ahead. Jack Miller was not the kind of man you'd find in a history book. He didn't give speeches or lead armies. He was a quiet man who liked engines more than words. Before the war, he worked as a delivery driver in a small town in Ohio. He knew every road, every back street, and every diner where the coffee was hot and the pie was cheap. When America entered World War II, he didn't think twice about joining. He wasn't after glory, he just wanted to do his part. By December 1944, Jack had been in Europe for 6 months. He had seen plenty of wrecked towns, long convoys, and the constant grey skies of war. But nothing prepared him for the cold of the Ardennes that winter. The snow came down thick, covering everything, roads, tanks, and even the dead. The wind sliced through his coat like knives. His truck heater had broken weeks ago, and the metal steering wheel felt like ice under his gloves. Still he drove. That morning, Jack had been given a simple order: deliver a full tanker of gasoline to a forward supply post near the town of St. Vith. It sounded like a routine mission, but that was before the German offensive began. Now the entire region was chaos. Radio messages were confused, units were scattered, and no one was sure who was holding which road. Jack loaded his truck, 2,400 gallons of high-octane fuel sloshing in the cold steel tank, and set out with a convoy of other drivers. The engines growled to life, sending clouds of white exhaust into the frozen air. They drove slowly, following a map that was already out of date. The road was narrow, winding between tall pine trees heavy with snow. Sometimes they passed small villages where houses were half destroyed by shell fire. Windows were broken, doors hung open, and smoke rose from chimneys where civilians still tried to keep warm. Jack thought about home, about his wife Clara, and his 2 young kids. He had written them a letter the night before, promising to be careful. He didn't know when they'd get it, or if he'd ever get the chance to write another. The convoy rolled on. The men barely spoke, talking wasted breath, and every breath turned to fog anyway. They were focused on one thing: keeping the trucks moving. By mid-afternoon, the snow turned to sleet. The road became a sheet of ice. Trucks slid, wheels spun, and drivers cursed quietly through chattering teeth. A few miles ahead, a bridge had been destroyed by retreating Americans to slow the German advance. A new detour had been marked, but no one was sure if it was correct. The sign looked strange, freshly painted, nailed crookedly to a post. The lead truck turned right. Jack followed. They didn't know it yet, but the sign had been switched by German commandos disguised as US soldiers. The road they were on didn't lead to the supply depot. It led straight toward the front. As the miles passed, the convoy grew smaller. Some trucks got stuck or broke down. Radio signals crackled and faded. When darkness came, Jack realized he could no longer see any lights ahead or behind him. He was alone. He stopped for a moment and stepped out into the snow. The forest was silent, except for the faint rumble of distant artillery. The air smelled of oil and smoke. He wiped his goggles clean and checked his map under a flashlight. Nothing made sense. The road signs didn't match the chart. He muttered to himself, "Damn it, this isn't set right." Still, he couldn't just stop in the middle of a war zone, so he climbed back into the truck and pushed on. The tires crunched over ice. The headlights glowed dimly against the swirling snow. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound made him reach for the pistol under his seat. Jack was not a man easily scared, but that night he felt something he hadn't felt before: the sharp, cold edge of uncertainty. Hours passed. The gas gauge on his dashboard barely moved, but the road seemed endless. Then, in the distance, he saw flickering lights, maybe a camp, maybe a village. He slowed down. As he got closer, he saw the dark shapes of tanks and men. American uniforms, thank God. He pulled up and waved. A sergeant ran toward him, shouting over the wind, "Where the hell did you come from?" Jack leaned out the window. "Got a fuel delivery, St. Vith Depot." The sergeant laughed, a strange, relieved laugh. "Buddy, This is the front. Those tanks are out of gas. You just saved us. Jack blinked in disbelief. He had driven straight into a front-line position, a group of armored units that had been stranded without fuel for almost a day. Their engines were cold, their radios nearly dead. They were preparing to destroy their tanks so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. Instead, Jack's wrong turn had brought them exactly what they needed. The soldiers moved fast, filling their tanks with the precious gasoline. The air filled with the smell of fuel and the metallic clang of hoses. Engines roared to life one by one. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. One of the tank commanders clapped Jack on the shoulder and said, "You got more guts than luck, driver. You just gave us a fighting chance." Jack didn't feel like a hero. He was cold, tired, and a little embarrassed. All he had done was follow a road, but that road, that mistake, had changed everything. Those tanks would soon take part in a counterattack that stopped a key German advance. The fuel Jack delivered gave the Americans the strength to hold their position until reinforcements arrived. He slept in his truck that night, listening to the sound of engines in the dark. For the first time in days, he smiled. Sometimes history is not made by men with medals or maps. Sometimes it is made by a driver with frozen hands who refuses to stop. Jack Miller didn't know it yet, but his story was only beginning. The next morning came slowly. The sky was still dark, heavy with clouds, and the snow had not stopped. Jack Miller woke up stiff and cold in the driver's seat of his truck. His back ached, and his fingers were numb even inside his gloves. He could see his breath fogging up the window. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then he heard the deep rumble of tank engines and remembered everything. Outside, soldiers were busy. Men were loading ammunition, checking machine guns, and clearing snow off the tanks. The smell of fuel and oil filled the air. Some men laughed quietly, trying to stay warm by sharing jokes and lighting cigarettes. But most had tired eyes. They had been fighting non-stop for days. Jack climbed down from his truck and stretched his arms. His clothes were stiff with frost. A young private handed him a tin cup of coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, but it tasted like life. "Thanks, kid," Jack said, his voice rough. The private smiled. "You saved us last night, sir. Without that gas, we'd be stuck out here for good." Jack shook his head. "Just doing my job." But deep down, he felt something strange. A quiet pride. He had never thought of himself as brave. Yet somehow he had helped an entire armored unit survive. The officer in charge, Captain Raymond Holt, walked over. He was tall, with a hard face and a tired look in his eyes. His uniform was covered in snow, and his helmet had a dent on one side. "Miller, right?" the captain said. "Yes, sir," Jack answered. "Yusuf got nerves of steel," Holt said. "Most men would turned back in that storm. You drove right into the thick of it." Jack gave a small smile. "Didn't just have much choice, sir. Couldn't just tell where I was going." Holt chuckled. "Well, your mistake just gave us a miracle. We stir moving out in an hour. Germans are pushing hard on this sector. We stir gonna make them regret it." Jack nodded. "Good luck, Captain." Holt looked at him for a moment. "You start coming with us. We can start leave that fuel truck behind. We still need every drop." Jack wanted to protest. He was a driver, not a soldier. But when he saw the faces of the men, he knew there was no point arguing. So he climbed back into his truck and started the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and finally came alive. The convoy rolled forward through the snow. Tanks led the way, their metal tracks crushing the ice beneath them. Jack followed close behind, the tanker shaking on the uneven road. Every few minutes he looked at the frozen trees on both sides. They looked calm, but he knew enemy soldiers could be hiding anywhere. Then came the first sound. A sharp whistle in the distance, followed by a loud boom. Artillery shells exploded somewhere ahead. The ground shook, and snow fell from the trees like rain. The men ducked instinctively. "Keep moving," Captain Holt shouted through the radio. "Don't set stop." Jack's heart pounded. He had never been this close to the front before. Bullets started cracking through the air. A shell landed on the road just 50 yards away, sending dirt and snow flying over the truck. Jack gripped the wheel tighter. The tanks returned fire. Their cannons roared, echoing through the valley. Smoke and dust filled the air. The snow turned black from soot and shrapnel. Jack could barely see, but he kept driving. He thought of his family again, of Clara and the kids, and whispered to himself, "Just one more mile. Keep going." Suddenly, one of the tanks ahead stopped. Its turret was damaged. The crew jumped out, shouting for help. Jack saw one man fall, hit by gunfire. Another tried to pull him back. Without thinking, Jack stopped his truck, jumped out, and ran toward them. "Get him on the truck," he shouted. Together they dragged the wounded soldier into the tanker's cabin. His leg was bleeding badly. Jack ripped a piece of cloth from his coat and tied it around the wound. The man groaned but stayed alive. A young gunner looked at Jack and said, "You sot crazy old man." Jack laughed weakly. "Maybe, but we start all crazy out here." The fighting went on for hours. The tanks slowly pushed forward, yard by yard, while Jack's truck followed with supplies and fuel. Each time they stopped, soldiers refilled their vehicles from his tanker. Without that fuel, they would have been sitting ducks. By evening, the sounds of battle began to fade. The Germans had pulled back for now. The Americans had held the line just barely. The men cheered, but their faces showed exhaustion more than joy. Captain Holt walked up to Jack again. "You did good today, Miller. You sawed one tough son of a gun." Jack smiled tiredly. "Guess I just had good luck." "Luck or not," Holt said, "you saved lives. That counts more than luck." They set up camp that night, near the edge of a frozen field. Fires were lit, and soldiers gathered around to eat their rations. Jack sat quietly, holding a tin of beans, staring at the flames. His hands were still shaking from the day's terror, but his heart was calm. He listened to the men talking, about home, about baseball, about the food they missed. Some laughed, some cried softly when they thought no one was watching. Jack realized something. Even in war, men still found ways to feel human. Later, Holt came over with a cigarette. "Here," he said, lighting it for Jack. "You earned it." Jack took a long drag and looked at the dark sky. "Do you think we shall make it out of this, Captain?" Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe. But if we don't set, we still make damn sure they remember we tried." Jack nodded. That was enough. When he finally lay down in the back of his truck, the wind howled outside, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced the front, faced death, and still kept driving. Tomorrow would bring more danger, maybe worse. Yet something inside him had changed. He knew now that courage didn't always mean charging with a gun. Sometimes it just meant staying behind the wheel when every instinct told you to stop. As he drifted to sleep, the engines of the tanks hummed softly in the distance. A steady reminder that even in the darkest nights of war, hope still had a sound. The next morning was brighter, though the air still cut like glass. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold had grown sharper. The tanks and trucks stood in long rows, covered in frost that glittered under the pale sun. Steam rose from engines as men worked to bring them back to life. Jack Miller climbed out of his truck and stamped his boots on the frozen ground. His breath came out in white clouds. The sound of metal being hammered, engines coughing, and shouted orders filled the camp. He could smell gasoline everywhere, sharp, oily, and strangely comforting. Captain Holt waved him over. "Miller, we've got word from command," he said. "German armor is heading straight toward this valley. We've to hold the road at all costs. Every gallon of gas you brought will decide if we live or die today." Jack nodded silently. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a tired truck driver who just wanted to go home. But he knew now, his fuel wasn't just fuel, it was life. Soon tanks rolled up one by one beside his truck. Crewmen carried hoses and began refueling. Jack helped them, his gloves stiff from frost. The liquid gold, 80-octane gasoline, gushed into the tanks. The engines roared to life one after another, loud enough to shake the trees. Private Wilkins, a young tank gunner, grinned at Jack. "Smells like victory, huh?" Jack smiled weakly. "Smells like work to me." For the next hour, Jack worked non-stop. His back ached, his hands were numb, but he kept going. One by one, tanks rolled out, their treads biting into the snow. The ground trembled under the weight of 50-ton machines. By noon, the valley came alive with movement. Shermans moved into position. Half-tracks carried soldiers with rifles ready. Snow and mud sprayed as the convoy prepared for battle. From far away, the low rumble of German armor could be heard, deeper, slower, heavier. "Here they come," Holt said quietly, scanning the horizon with binoculars. The first explosions began shortly after. Artillery shells landed close, sending plumes of white snow and black smoke into the sky. The air filled with thunder. The men ducked, shouted, and fired back. Jack jumped into the cab of his truck, pressing himself low. The windshield cracked as a fragment of metal hit it. But he stayed put. He couldn't run. The tanks needed more fuel, and he was the only one who could give it. Between shell bursts, Jack climbed out, dragging the hose again to refill another half-empty tank. "Miller, get back!" someone shouted. "Connest," Jack yelled. "They cell run dry." He pulled the hose tight, connected it, and turned the valve. Gasoline poured through as the engines around him kept roaring. The smell of exhaust and burnt oil mixed with smoke and gunpowder, a choking, heavy smell of war. Then came the sound that everyone feared, the grinding roar of German panzer tanks approaching. Jack saw them through the haze, big, dark shapes moving through the snow, their guns flashing orange. "Shermans, open fire," Captain Holt shouted. The American tanks fired back, their cannons thundering so loudly the ground seemed to shake. Shells flew both ways. Some hit, some missed, some exploded too close. Snow and mud rained down on Jack's truck. Jack watched in awe and terror. The tanks he had fueled were now fighting like angry beasts. Every time a Sherman fired, he felt a strange pride. His gas was in that engine, his effort in that power. A sergeant ran past him, shouting orders. "Miller, we're pulling the wounded back to the rear line. Stay with the fuel." Jack nodded. He wanted to help the wounded, but he couldn't abandon the truck. If the Germans captured it, they'd have the very fuel they needed. He checked the pressure gauge. Only a quarter tank left. Most of his fuel was already in the field. The battle raged on for hours. Snow turned black with soot and red with blood. Machine guns rattled, mortars screamed, and men shouted through the chaos. The once quiet forest now sounded like the inside of a thunderstorm. At one point, a German shell hit just 20 feet from Jack's truck. The blast threw him to the ground. His ears rang. When he looked up, the side of the truck was dented, and smoke curled from the wheels. He thought the fuel might ignite, but somehow it didn't. He coughed, got back up, and climbed inside again. Through the cracked windshield, he could see Captain Holt waving his arm. "Hold the line, keep firing." And somehow, they did. The Americans held their position. The Shermans used the narrow road to create a choke point, hitting the German armor, one after another. Some tanks were destroyed, others turned back. The German attack slowed, then stopped. When evening came, silence finally returned to the valley. Smoke drifted slowly upward, mixing with the falling snow. The battlefield looked like another planet. Black craters, broken trees, burned tanks. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and death. Captain Holt approached Jack Sepp's truck, limping slightly. His face was covered in soot, and his helmet was gone. "We did it," he said quietly. They set to retreating. Jack looked around. "At what cost?" he said softly. Holt sighed. "Too high. But if you hadn't brought that gas, Miller, they have rolled right through us. You gave us our teeth back." Jack didn't know what to say. He just stared at his truck, dented, dirty, but still standing. A mistake had led him here, a wrong turn, and yet that mistake had given these men the power to fight back. Later that night, the men gathered around small fires. Some wrote letters home. Others just sat in silence, staring at the flames. Jack joined them, his hands trembling from exhaustion. Private Wilkins handed him a piece of bread and said, "You know, sir, they'll probably never write about this in the papers." Jack smiled faintly. "That sip's all right. I sit no no. The fire crackled softly. In the distance, the rumble of retreating German engines faded away. Jack leaned back and looked up at the sky, a cold, starless expanse. He thought of all the people back home who would never know how close the line had come to breaking. He thought of the soldiers who would fight again tomorrow. And he thought of one small truth that the war had taught him. Sometimes the biggest victories are born from the smallest mistakes. The next few days after the battle were quiet, too quiet. Snow still covered everything, and the forest smelled of smoke and cold metal. The men were exhausted but alive. Jack Miller woke up every morning to the same sound. Engines warming up, boots crunching on frozen ground, and distant artillery far off to the east. The Battle of the Bulge was not over, but something had changed. The German attack, once strong and fast, was now slowing down. At first, Hitler's army had moved like a hammer, quick, powerful, and confident. But now that hammer had no fuel, their tanks, trucks, and half-tracks stood silent on the snowy roads. The great German plan was falling apart, not because of courage alone, but because they had run out of gasoline. Jack didn't know all the details, but the officers did. They spoke quietly around maps at night, marking arrows and crossing out towns. "They've burned through everything," Captain Holt said one evening. "They thought they'd capture our fuel dumps, but they missed them. Now they're stuck in the snow." One soldier nearby laughed. "Guess the Americans won this one with gas cans."
He wasn't wrong.
Statistics later showed that during the offensive, the Germans used nearly 500,000 gallons of fuel a day, but they could only transport about a quarter of that amount. Their tanks sat abandoned all over the Ardennes, powerful machines with empty bellies. Some were destroyed by their own crews to keep them from falling into Allied hands. Jack saw a few of them himself. When his unit pushed forward through the forest roads, he passed burnt-out panthers and tigers, their black shells half buried in snow. The smell of oil and burnt rubber still hung in the air. He remembered thinking how strange it was that such deadly machines could look so helpless without fuel, like beasts starved to death. "See that, Miller?" Captain Holt said, pointing at one wreck. "That seb's what happens when you fight a war on empty tanks." Jack nodded slowly. "Guess gas won this war, sir." "Gas and grit," Holt replied. "You can have one without the other." Every mile forward showed more signs of German collapse. Soldiers who had once charged with confidence were now surrendering in groups, cold, hungry, and beaten. American troops offered them food and blankets. Some Germans cried when they received chocolate or cigarettes. Private Wilkins, riding in the passenger seat of Jack Sip's truck, said, "Funny, ain't sept, they thought we sept be the ones starving." Jack nodded. War turns everything upside down. By late December, the snow had turned grey from smoke. The roads were littered with burned trucks, broken rifles, and twisted metal. The silence was eerie, the kind of quiet that comes only after chaos. At one abandoned German outpost, Jack stopped to help check supplies. Inside a small hut, he found empty fuel drums marked with black crosses. On the wall was a rough map, drawn by hand. Someone had written to Bastogne with an arrow, the same road where they had fought days earlier. He stared at it for a long moment, realizing how close the enemy had come. If his wrong turn hadn't delivered fuel to Captain Holt's tanks, the Germans might have reached their goal. As they advanced, American engineers began repairing bridges and clearing snow from the roads. Convoys of new supplies moved in every direction. The smell of gasoline and diesel filled the cold air again, the smell of power returning. One night, while they camped near a burned-out village, Holt gathered the men. He looked tired but proud. "You all did more than your duty," he said. "We stopped the biggest German push of the war, and we did it with our engines running when theirs went silent." Someone shouted, "To the fuel men." The soldiers cheered and raised their cups of coffee. Jack felt embarrassed, but he smiled. For once, the supply men, the drivers, mechanics, and loaders, were being thanked. Usually, the glory went to the ones who fired the guns, not the ones who fueled them. After the cheers faded, Holt sat down beside Jack by the fire. "You know," he said softly, "I keep thinking about that wrong turn of yours." Jack laughed. You soul never let me live that down, huh? Not a chance, Holt said. You took the wrong road, and it led us straight to survival. Strange how that works. Jack looked into the flames. Maybe there sits no wrong road in war, sir. Just the one you end up taking. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and snow fell gently around them. In the following days, word spread fast. The German offensive had collapsed completely. By early January, the Allies were pushing them back toward the Rhine. Thousands of prisoners were taken. Over 700 German tanks and armored vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. Hitler's last gamble had failed. Yet for Jack, it wasn't victory that stayed in his mind. It was the faces of the men he'd driven beside, the wounded he'd helped, and the long, lonely roads that led him here. He didn't feel like a hero, he felt like a witness. When he looked at the snowy hills, he thought of how strange it was that a war filled with bombs and bullets could turn on something as simple as a gallon of gas. The world might talk about generals and strategies, but he knew the truth. Wars are won by the men who keep the engines running. That night, before sleeping, he opened his small notebook and wrote a few words. December 1944, wrong road, right place, still alive. He closed the book and tucked it into his jacket. Outside, the wind howled softly through the pines. The tanks stood silent now, engines cooling after victory. The snow fell again, clean and quiet, covering the scars of battle, for a little while. But deep inside the frozen earth of the Ardennes, the ghosts of that fight and the echo of roaring engines would remain forever. When the fighting finally ended, the forests of the Ardennes were quiet again. The snow lay thick over the burned tanks and broken trees, covering everything like a blanket that tried to hide the scars of war. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble, was over. What was left were stories, memories, and lessons that would never be forgotten. Jack Miller stood beside his truck, now battered and rusted at the edges. The front windshield was cracked, the paint blackened from smoke, and one headlight hung loose, but it still ran, just like him. It was January 1945, and the sky was pale blue. American soldiers were cleaning up the battlefield, loading the wounded and clearing the wrecks. The air smelled of diesel, ash, and cold metal. In the distance, trucks moved slowly through the snow, carrying food, blankets, and supplies to towns that had been freed from German control. Jack watched as a group of Belgian children walked past. Their clothes were thin, their faces pale from hunger, but when a soldier handed them chocolate bars, they smiled. It was the first smile Jack had seen in weeks. He turned to Captain Holt, who was standing beside him. "Hard to believe it's really over," Jack said. Holt nodded. "For us, maybe. But for some, the war will never end. They still carry it inside them." Jack looked out at the frozen trees. "Guess we all will." The two men stood in silence for a while. Around them, the world was slowly coming back to life. Birds had returned to the trees. Smoke from campfires drifted lazily upward. The sound of engines, once a call to battle, now sounded peaceful, a reminder that life was still moving forward. The Battle of the Bulge had cost over 75,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The Germans had lost even more, almost 100,000 men and more than 700 tanks. It had been one of the coldest winters in Europe's history, and one of the bloodiest, but the Allies had won, not only because they fought bravely, but because they kept their armies fueled, fed, and moving. That truth stayed with Jack. He thought about how strange it was. Generals planned battles, presidents made speeches, but sometimes the whole course of history turned because one man didn't stop driving. Days later, Jack's unit received orders to return west. They would rejoin the main supply lines and prepare for the final push into Germany. Jack packed his few belongings, a small photo of his family, his notebook, and the worn gloves he'd used the night he got lost. Before leaving, he walked to the spot where he had made his wrong turn. The signpost was still there, though the wood was splintered from shrapnel. Snow covered the ground, hiding the tracks of the past. He smiled quietly. "Some wrong turns," he said to himself, "lead you exactly where you Serb meant to be." He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and began to drive again. Slowly, carefully, the tires crunching over the snow. The road ahead stretched long and winding, but it didn't scare him anymore. As he drove, he thought about what he would tell Clara and the kids when he got home. How could he explain everything? The cold, the fear, the men he'd met, the noise of the tanks, the silence afterward. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd just tell them about a snowy forest and how one wrong turn turned into something right. When Jack reached the next supply camp, he parked beside a line of other trucks. Men were laughing, cooking coffee over open fires, and playing cards. One soldier shouted, "Hey, that's Sips, the man with the lucky truck." Jack laughed and waved. Lucky, maybe, or just stubborn. That night, sitting by the fire, Jack wrote another line in his notebook. You don't have to be brave to make history. You just have to keep going when others can sit. He stared at the words for a while, then closed the notebook and tucked it away. The war would go on for a few more months, but its end was already written in the snow of the Ardennes. The German army would never recover from the losses they suffered there. Their tanks would never roar the same way again. The Allies were now pushing toward the Rhine, and soon the world would breathe again. Jack didn't think of himself as part of that grand history. He was just a driver, one man among millions. But history often belongs to people like him, ordinary men doing their jobs, making choices in moments that seem small but matter forever. Years later, long after the war had ended, Jack returned home and lived a quiet life. Sometimes at family gatherings, someone would ask, "Grandpa, what did you do in the war?" He would smile, take a sip of his coffee, and say, "I took a wrong turn once and helped win a battle." The kids would laugh, thinking he was joking. But Clara knew. She had read his old letters, stained with oil and dirt. She knew the truth, that courage comes in many forms. The story of Jack Miller never appeared in history books. There were no medals, no parades, no headlines. But among the men who had fought in that frozen forest, his name lived on, passed quietly from one soldier to another. They called him the man who brought the fire. In the end, that was enough. The Battle of the Bulge taught the world many lessons, that bravery can be found in unexpected places, that luck and courage often walk hand in hand, and that sometimes the smallest acts, a delivery, a decision, a wrong turn, can change the course of history. They had come as conquerors, some said, but they left as students, learning that power was not only in the gun, but in the fuel that kept it running, and in the human spirit that refused to quit. As Jack once wrote in his notebook, "In the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't its bombs or tanks. It was its will to keep moving, even through the cold." And in that endless winter, one man's mistake became one army's miracle.